Picture this. You're 14 years old. It's dawn in a small village near the Nile. The cliff's already turning gold, and you wake up on your reed mat to find something is wrong. There's blood. No pharmacy down the street. No little box on a shelf. No mother sliding open a drawer of supplies. It's 1200 BC, and you've just started your first period in ancient Egypt. So what on earth do you actually do? Here's the thing. This is a part of history almost every documentary skips. Not because it's unimportant, but because it's a little awkward, which is exactly why it's fascinating. Because the ancient Egyptians, unlike almost every other civilization before them, actually left clues. Real ones. Written down. So today we're stepping into their world to answer a question you've probably never thought about, but suddenly really want the answer to. How did the women of ancient Egypt handle their periods? Turns out, the answer is way more surprising and way more human than you'd think. If you love this kind of hidden history, take a second to subscribe. Okay, back to ancient Egypt. Let's set the scene properly. Forget golden pharaohs and glittering tombs for a moment. Most Egyptians weren't royalty. They were ordinary people living in tight little villages of mud brick houses, packed wall to wall along the green edge of the desert. Picture one of these homes, thick clay walls to keep out the heat. A few small rooms, a flat roof where the family sleeps on hot nights, a grinding stone in the corner where grain becomes flour. Now picture the woman of that house at dawn, barefoot on the cool packed earth floor, wrapped in a simple white linen dress, hair tied back, already carrying a water jar toward the river. This was a life lived almost entirely without privacy as we know it. Whole families shared a couple of rooms. Neighbors could hear each other through the walls. And into that world, every single month, came a completely normal biological event that, somehow, these people had to manage without a single thing you'd reach for today. No cotton, no plastic, no painkillers in a bottle. So the real question isn't just what did they use? It's how did an entire society quietly build a system around something the rest of the ancient world barely even acknowledged? And think about who that woman actually was. She probably married young, by our standards, often in her early teens. She might already be raising children of her own. Her days were a constant loop of physical work, hauling water jars on her hip up from the river, kneeling for hours to grind grain into flour on a rough stone, baking bread in a clay oven, and weaving linen in the shade. She couldn't just stop for a few days. Life on the Nile didn't pause, so whatever she did to manage her period, it had to fit into all of that, practical, portable, and repeatable. That constraint alone tells you their solution had to be genuinely clever, and it was. Now, here's what you'd probably assume. You'd think that in the ancient world, a woman's period was treated as something shameful, dirty, cursed, something to hide away in the dark. That's genuinely how many ancient cultures saw it. In some societies, a menstruating woman was considered unclean and forced into isolation. Egypt, not quite, and here's where it gets interesting. The Egyptian language actually gives us a clue. Historians who study their writing have noticed that the word connected to menstruation was tangled up with the same root as their word for natron, the sacred cleansing salt they used to purify temples, priests, and even mummies. In other words, the concept wasn't automatically dirty. It sat closer to the idea of cleansing and renewal. Now, let's be clear and honest here. We don't have a diary from an Egyptian teenager telling us how she felt. A lot of this is historians reading between the lines of medical scrolls and scraps of pottery. But the picture that emerges is startling. In Egypt, a period seems to have been treated less like a curse to be hidden, and more like a normal, even significant, part of a woman's life. And once you know that, everything about how they handled it starts to make a lot more sense. Okay, the practical question you've been waiting for. What did an Egyptian woman actually use? The answer starts with the single most important material in all of Egypt, linen. Picture a woman seated at a low wooden loom in the shade of a courtyard, palm leaves throwing striped shadows across her hands as she weaves. Linen came from the flax growing in the Black Nile mud, and the Egyptians were absolute masters of it. They wrapped their dead in it, they dressed their living in it, and they could weave it into anything from stiff sailcloth to a fabric so fine and soft you could read through it. That soft linen is almost certainly the answer. Historians believe women used folded pads of washable linen cloth, held in place with a simple belt or sash tied around the hips, reusable, rinsed in the river, dried in that relentless desert sun, and used again. Basically, a homemade pre-industrial version of what people were still using well into the 20th century. And there's a second, more surprising possibility. The evidence suggests some Egyptian women may have used a kind of early internal tampon, made from softened papyrus, reed, or rolled linen. Now, I want to be careful. This one is more educated guess than proven fact, and you'll see it stated a lot more confidently online than the evidence really allows. But given that these were people who used papyrus for paper, boats, sandals, and rope, the idea that they'd repurpose it here isn't a stretch. It's a very Egyptian solution. And here's a detail that makes the whole thing feel real. Cleanliness mattered enormously to these people. Bathing was practically a daily ritual. So picture a woman at the river's edge in the early morning light, kneeling on the wet gray Nile mud, rinsing a strip of linen in the cool current while herons pick their way through the reeds nearby. Back home, she might soak that cloth in a solution of natron, that same cleansing salt, laid out to dry stiff and white under a sun so strong it practically sterilized everything it touched. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a routine, repeated month after month, quietly woven into the rhythm of the river. Now hold on. Before we go further, there's an obvious question we've skipped right past. What about the pain? Because a period isn't just about managing blood. Then, as now, it could come with cramps, aches, and misery. And here's the good news. The Egyptians were arguably the finest doctors of the ancient world, and they absolutely tried to help. Picture that village healer again, an oil lamp glowing against a mud brick wall, shelves lined with little clay pots and stopper jars, the air thick with the smell of herbs and incense. Their medical scrolls, like the famous Ebers Papyrus from around 1550 BC, are packed with real remedies for women's aches and pains, mixtures of herbs, oils, and that Egyptian miracle ingredient, honey. Some concoctions were swallowed, some were warmed and applied. And honey, remember, never truly spoils, so technically their medicine had a longer shelf life than most things in your fridge. Then there was the oldest painkiller of all, heat. Imagine a woman lying on a woven reed mat in the cool shadow of her home, a smooth stone warmed in the embers of the cooking fire and wrapped in linen, pressed against her aching belly. That's not ancient superstition, that's a heating pad. The exact same trick your grandmother swears by. 3,000 years apart, and the human answer to cramps barely changed at all. They didn't have ibuprofen, but they had honey, warm stones, and a deep practical understanding of the human body that we spent thousands of years catching back up to. Here's where we stop guessing and look at something real. Around 1825 BC, that's older than the famous Golden Age of Pharaohs, older than King Tut by centuries. Someone in Egypt sat down and wrote the oldest known medical text about women's health in human history. We call it the Kahun Gynecological Papyrus, and the incredible thing is where it came from. A real workers' town, a place where ordinary craftsmen and their families lived. Picture the scroll itself, a long strip of pale papyrus, brittle and brown at the edges, covered in tight columns of cursive hieroglyphs written in dark reed pen ink. And what's on it? Page after page of practical advice about women's bodies, how to tell if someone can have children, treatments for pain, ways to understand the menstrual cycle. Nearly 4,000 years ago, Egyptian doctors were paying close, careful attention to exactly this. Then there's a second document that's almost better because it's so ordinary. In another famous workers' village, the men who built the royal tombs kept attendance records, literally sick day logs, scratched onto flakes of white limestone and broken pottery we call ostraca. And on some of those absence lists, historians have found a genuinely stunning reason a worker stayed home: because a woman in his household was menstruating. Think about how extraordinary that is. Most of the ancient world left us almost nothing on this subject. A stray line here, a religious rule there. But in Egypt, ordinary working people, in two different villages separated by centuries, left behind both a careful medical manual and casual day-to-day notes. It's as if a whole civilization decided this simply wasn't something to whisper about. And that quiet openness is exactly why we can reconstruct so much of the story today. Let that land for a second, because it's the detail that gets everyone. Roughly 3,000 years ago, a man could miss a day of hard labor on a royal tomb, and the foreman would record the reason as his wife or daughter having her period. Picture the scene: a dusty work crew filing up the path into the Valley of the Kings at sunrise, chisels and copper tools over their shoulders, and one name missing from the line. The scribe dips his reed pen and notes it down on a shard of pottery. Reason for absence: the women of his house. Why would that even be a thing? Historians have a few ideas. It might have been practical. In a household where women handled the water carrying, the grinding, the cooking, someone had to cover that work. It might have been tied to those ideas of ritual purity we talked about. We honestly don't know for certain. But the simple fact that it was written down, matter-of-factly, in an official record, no shame, no euphemism, just a noted reason, tells you something profound about how normal and accepted this was. And that's the "you'd never guess" twist. We tend to imagine ancient people as harsher and more repressed than us. But here's a Bronze Age work site quietly building menstruation into its official schedule, something plenty of modern workplaces still can't manage to do today. And picture the human side of it. A father staying back in the cool of the mud brick house while the sun climbs, grinding a little grain, minding the younger children, fetching the water his wife or daughter would normally carry from the river. No drama, no embarrassment, just a family quietly rearranging itself for a few days, exactly the way families always have. It's such an ordinary scene, and yet it's 3,000 years old. Now the story takes a genuinely strange turn, and this is the part that shows just how differently they saw the whole thing. To the Egyptians, menstrual blood wasn't just waste to be dealt with. In their world of medicine and magic, which to them were the same thing, it was considered powerful. Their medical papyri, the same kind of scrolls that gave us real remedies using honey and willow, actually list menstrual blood as an ingredient. It shows up in recipes meant to protect the skin, to treat certain ailments, even smeared as a kind of protective charm. Picture a village healer at dusk, an oil lamp flickering against a mud brick wall, mixing a salve by hand from ingredients most of us would never dream of. To us, that sounds bizarre. To them, it followed a perfect internal logic. This was the substance tied to fertility, to the creation of new life. And in a civilization obsessed with life, death, and rebirth, what could possibly be more potent than that? Because that's the deeper truth here. A period, to an Egyptian, was proof of fertility, and fertility was everything. It was survival, it was legacy, it was the favor of the gods. Women prayed to household protectors like Taweret, the fierce hippo goddess of pregnancy, and Bez, the funny little dwarf god who guarded mothers and children. A regular cycle meant a woman could bring new life into the world. Far from a curse, it was closer to a sign of power, and that belief shaped real life. In a society where a family's survival depended on having children to work the land and carry on the name, a woman who could bear children held genuine value and status. Marriage contracts protected her. Egyptian women could own property, run businesses, inherit, and even go to court, rights that women in many later civilizations would spend thousands of years fighting to win back. Picture a woman in the marketplace, standing over baskets of figs and fresh fish, haggling in the morning bustle, coins of copper changing hands, a person with her own standing in the world. It's tempting to think the roots of that respect ran all the way down to the simple monthly proof that she could create life. To the Egyptians, that wasn't shameful. It was, in a very real sense, sacred. But strip away the gods and the strange remedies, and you're left with something incredibly familiar. Because at the end of the day, these were women tracking their own bodies, counting the days, knowing their own rhythms, quietly helping the younger girls in the family when their turn came. Picture a mother and daughter sitting together on a rooftop under the stars, the cool night breeze coming off the river, one of them explaining to the other what's happening and what to do. That conversation is thousands of years old. It has happened in every generation of human beings who ever lived. They didn't have our products or our science, but they had cloth and clever hands, a scroll of hard-won medical knowledge, a society that wrote the whole thing down without flinching, and a network of women who passed their know-how from mother to daughter to granddaughter. That's not primitive. That's a system. A quiet, functional, deeply human system. And maybe that's the part that lingers. We tend to look back at ancient people as impossibly distant, strangers in a strange golden world of gods and pyramids. But this is the opposite of distant. A teenage girl scared and confused on her first morning, a mother reassuring her, a healer mixing something to ease the pain, a father quietly picking up the slack for a few days, a whole community treating a completely normal part of life as exactly that, normal. Strip away the linen and the hieroglyphs, and you're looking at your own family, your own kitchen table conversations, your own small acts of care. The tools have changed, the humanity hasn't. So next time you're standing in a brightly lit store, grabbing a box off a shelf without a second thought, remember that girl waking up on her reed mat by the Nile 3,000 years ago. She faced the exact same reality you do, with no factories, no pharmacies, no science as we know it. And yet she and the women around her figured it out. They wove their own solutions, wrote down what they learned, and built a world where a period was simply a part of life. Not a secret to be buried. In some ways, they were more open about it than we still manage to be today. If you learned something you'll never unknow, hit that like button, and tell me in the comments. Which surprised you more, the 4,000-year-old medical scroll, or the men getting the day off? Subscribe for more hidden history, and I'll see you in the next one.